meditations of our hearts be acceptable in your sight, for you are our strength and our Redeemer. Amen. Fascinating reading from the Gospel of St. Luke. I have a couple of sentences to share with you, written this week by John Luoma about this passage. Why be on guard against greed? Because riches and the desire for riches have the potential to alienate a person from God and God's purposes. It was common knowledge in Hebrew culture that anyone who had a surplus should feel called upon to share it. If possessions exceeded need, possessions were to be shared with the poor. You think back to those times in Hebrew Scripture and remember the admonition that the fields of grain were to be harvested, but there was a certain amount of acreage that was to be set aside for those who needed bread, barley, oats, any kind of grain. There was always that set aside in the acreage that farmers had. They didn't harvest every acre. They saved some so that the poor could have it as well. Reminds me a little bit of what the farmers still do in the mountains of Pennsylvania. I was there for a couple of days this week, and the corn is magnificent. It's up here above my head because of all the 90-plus degrees days and all the humidity, which is great corn growing weather. Every farmer leaves an acre or two of corn for winter feed for the wildlife, for the deer and other animals who will be living through the winter. They don't have to keep it all. We have an interesting reading here in that we have a farmer who has been incredibly blessed with an abundant crop. And he's excited, he's exhilarated, he's happy. And those of us who know a little bit about gardening or farming realize that it's not all of our doing. The miracle of growth, good weather, the combination lead to a good harvest. And isn't it fascinating that in this gospel reading, the farmer is so impressed with the abundance, and he says to himself, "My gosh, I've got more than I've ever had. What should I do? I know. I will build bigger barns so that I can store it." Now, given the admonition of the Jewish law and practice of the day and of the time, isn't it fascinating that the Scripture does not share with us that it never occurred to the farmer that in the midst of an abundant blessing, he too could be a blessing to someone else? I have more than I've ever had, more than I need. What's the classic example in the world today of profound greed? I might as well jump on the bandwagon and talk about British Petroleum, shouldn't I? Poor British Petroleum. And now that the story is coming out and we are beginning to fit the pieces of the puzzle together, it does seem that British Petroleum in the last decade or so has had a record of lowering safety standards, going faster and harder for the strike. And as a result, it appears that the oil-dwelling rig, the Deepwater Horizon, that process was so anxious to reach this magnificent find of oil that safety was disregarded several times, and as a consequence now, because of greed, 11 men are dead, and the livelihood of thousands of families has been jeopardized. Greed. And each of you has your own take on this story, your own understanding of what happened, but it does appear that there was a driving factor here, which was to lay aside concerns for livelihood and safety and well-being and the lives of those working in order to make the strike. I think over and over again, we can think of ways that greed consumes, takes over our lives. And now I will be quick to acknowledge that none of us has any idea how much we will need by way of resources to live our lives. Because suddenly we are in a time of economic uncertainty. We do wonder, will I personally have enough savings? Will I have enough pension income? Will I have enough Social Security? These are questions that every one of us thinks about as we live our lives and plan for our old age. But I think we also recognize in our hearts and in the fabric of our being when we have been incredibly blessed. And whether or not the first thought is, how can I also be a blessing to someone else as a result of my abundance? I want to tell you an old Pennsylvania farm story. You knew you couldn't get out without this. Two brothers worked together on the family farm. One was married, had a large family. The other was single. At the day's end, the brothers shared everything equally, the produce and the profit. Then one day, the single brother said to himself, "It's not right that we should share equally the produce and the profit. I'm alone, and my needs are simple." So each night, he took a sack of grain from his bin and crept across the barn and dumped it into his brother's bin. Meanwhile, the married brother said to himself, "It's not right that we should share the produce and the profit equally. After all, I'm married, and I have my wife and children to look after me in the years to come. I'll be taken care of. My brother has no one, and no one to take care of him when he's older." So each night, he took a sack of grain, walked across the barn, and dumped it into his brother's bin. Both men were puzzled for years because their supply of grain seemed to stay the same. Then one dark night, the two brothers bumped into